Welcome. I'm Bob Lee, the president of the China Society of Southern California. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California and will be recorded. If you have any questions, please enter them in the question and answer box, and we will try to get to them as soon as we can. Next month is Chinese New Year. UC Irvine celebrates Chinese New Year's with a festival. This year they invited the China Society to join them. The highlight of their activities will be an I Ching virtual event. Yang and the 8 trigrams is one of the most recognized of Chinese symbols. But what does the essence of the I Ching really mean? I don't really know. I have a copy of the I Ching, the Book of Changes, on my shelf, and I've had it there for years. I don't think I've even opened it. Too intimidating. Yet the UCI flyer says the I Ching is the world's oldest oracle. It's a book of Chinese wisdom that for obtaining spiritual guidance, inspirational insight, and universal wisdom. And because this is one of their Chinese New Year festivals, all of this will be made easy to understand and enjoyable, I hope. What more can we ask? Please sign up for the Chinese New Year meeting. It will be February 8th, 6:30 p.m. Now on to our program for today. I hope most of our people are here. Do you think I should wait a few more minutes? I don't know, we're at 47. Well, anyway. Devin Fitzgerald is the curator of rare books and the history of printing at the UCLA Library Special Collections. I am a graduate of UCLA, though I graduated quite a number of years ago and never heard of the special collections. So I have asked Devin to also tell us a little about the special collections. I met Devin at a Chinese Historical Society meeting a little over a year ago. The talk dealt with books that were published by Chinese immigrants to the United States during late 19th and early 20th century. The talk was very interesting, but not really quite what we want for China Society. So I asked him if he could give us another talk, and he was very generous to say yes. Devin has a PhD in history and East Asian languages from Harvard. He uses 12 languages in his work, including Chinese, Japanese, Italian, Latin. He's going to share his knowledge of both Western and Eastern printing technology and languages with his presentation today. So without further ado, Devin Fitzgerald.
Thank you so much, Bob, and Felicia, for inviting me and facilitating this discussion this evening. Today, I'm going to be talking about something that I'm fairly passionate about, which is in my capacity as the curator of rare books in the history of printing at UCLA Library Special Collections. I'm responsible for dealing with books from all periods in all places in the world. So in UCLA Library Special Collections, we have a large collection of European medieval manuscripts, right now at about 500 different medieval manuscripts. We also have the largest collection of 16th century Italian printed books in North America. And we also have a very sizable collection of pre-modern Chinese rare books. And so part of my job is to share these books and different ways of interpreting them with UCLA undergraduate students, as well as with faculty and graduate students. And so today we'll be talking about what it means when we look at books comparatively. Um, and here in this first slide, you can see a little bit of what happens in UCLA Library Special Collections. We're very fortunate that as a teaching university, all of our rare books and special collections material is regularly used for teaching students. In this image on the right, you can see Matthew Fisher's class in medieval paleography. And in this class, students from several different disciplines get together and then they learn how to read and interpret rare European manuscript materials. And it was also in this class where I had the privilege of teaching Matthew Fisher's students, who focus primarily on Europe, what they can learn from a deeper appreciation of pre-modern Chinese manuscript materials. On the left, you have another example of a graduate student seminar, and you can see Sue Chun, the head of the East Asia Library here, where she's introducing UCLA graduate students in Chinese history and literature to our large collection of pre-modern imperial examination papers. The Chinese examination system, which was established during the Tang Dynasty, so around the year 700, was the primary way of recruiting officials to work in the government. And I would say after this last week, I think that a standardized test for recruiting government officials sounds like a really good idea. But here we see these students are actually able to work with the original materials. So at UCLA, we steward these materials, we protect these materials, but we also make sure they're part of a rigorous teaching resources. Which brings me to my next point, which is why should we have comparative discussions of the book? I think everyone in this meeting knows very well that when we talk about the history of the printing in the West, what immediately comes to mind are books printed in movable type after Johannes Gutenberg invented the press. In this image on the left from the collection of Aldus Manutius, he was a very important Renaissance Italian printer, really dominated the book trade from about 1510, from about 1500 up to the 15 teens. And you can see he has a book that looks like what we recognize as a book. He's got his trademark here, this dolphin and anchor symbol. It has a title page that goes right into a poem. And on the right, we have a pre-modern Chinese book that also has publication information. So this is from Mao Jin, a Hangzhou area publisher. And he's saying he's basing it on a Song Dynasty, so an 11th century edition. And that means that this Chinese book, which is printed around 1590, is actually based on a printed edition from the year 1100. And so in a comparative discussion of books, we get to see and consider what the major differences are between these two books that by almost the same period had similar features. They have publication information, they have engagement with classical traditions, and they had in many ways similar formats, which is this bound codex format. What we call this modern type of printing is the codex. This was the same in China and East Asia at this time. But once you walk away from the books, you see things start looking a little bit different. On the left, you can see early modern European books printed and bound in hard covers. On the right, you have a modern reprinted edition of a Chinese classical text. And these volumes are all soft, but they were stored together in a box. And so once you start looking at these books side by side, like I often have students do at UCLA, important differences start to emerge. While both books function in different ways, people can open them, access information randomly. At the end of the day, the structure and the materials in each book are radically distinct. Which leads me to the next question, which is, what are different ways we can start approaching comparing books and book cultures? Well, the first thing we could do is talk about cultural comparisons. How do books lead to similar cultural phenomena? In both Europe and East Asia at roughly the same time, we see new interest in what we call antiquarianism. There are scholars who are researching classical texts, they're comparing different versions of texts, and then they're also engaging in archaeology. And this is one thing that doesn't really happen before the printed book in either East Asia or Europe. We could also compare the social comparisons, which is what does it mean when we talk about a print culture? Print radically altered the cultures of both Europe and East Asia. And there are different ways we could talk about those comparisons that I think would be interesting to many members of this group. And finally, and this is what I'll be focused on today, are technological or technical comparisons. One thing that lets us start understanding how different and similar pre-modern European and Chinese books are is through a consideration of their methods of production and things as simple as what it takes to make a sheet of paper or how we get a font that looks like a Times New Roman font. And so for the rest of my talk today, we'll be focusing a little bit on those material considerations. So just so you have a sense of where we're going, today I'm going to start by talking about something fundamental and important, which is what's the difference between a pre-modern sheet of European paper and a pre-modern sheet of Chinese paper. Next, I'm going to be talking about the features of the script. Why is it that Chinese readers can read 8th century Chinese books, whereas Europeans in general or Westerners can't read the fonts used to write in 12th, 13th century European books. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about printing techniques and think about what those mean for the differences between Gutenberg's press and pre-modern Chinese books. And then I'll end with some brief conclusions. So the first thing to understand about the differences between pre-modern Europe and China is how fundamentally different papers were. On the left, we can see a European paper mill. This is from the Encyclopédie by Diderot. And so this is what a 18th century European paper factory would have looked like. We have people pulling paper from a vat. There are people then here putting the masticated paper into the vat for pulling. Here sheets are being couched and pressed. And in East Asia, you can see an immediate difference already, which is this processing of raw plant materials. Here we have figures chopping bamboo prior to then soaking the bamboo in a pool with lime. Then after it had soaked for usually several months, it would then be boiled continuously for 10 days. So as I'm sure everyone in this meeting knows, the Chinese invented papermaking. The earliest fragments of paper we have in China date to around the year 200 BC. And at that point, Chinese papers were very rough things made from discarded fabrics. But starting around the year 100 AD in the Han Dynasty, Chinese papermaking techniques advanced in a significant way, which is that a scholar official, Cai Lun, reported to the Han court that he was capable of making paper out of raw plant materials. So for the rest of Chinese history, from about 100 up until the present day, Chinese papers were made from raw plant materials, which were processed through that aforementioned method of soaking in a pool of lime, continually boiling, and then chopping up into a fine mesh and submerging it into a pool. By the 11th century, Chinese papermaking techniques had traveled across the world. So beginning in around the year 800, we start seeing Islamic papermaking, which has been learned from Chinese artisans in Central Asia. By the 11th century, the Islamic caliphates have brought papermaking technologies to southern Spain. So Islamic papermaking mills in southern Spain are the first paper mills in Europe. But even though Europeans are making paper starting in the 11th, 12th, 13th century, paper is not particularly popular. Most books are written on parchment. which is animal skin. And one reason why papers are not popular in Europe is because they're very expensive to make. Unlike in East Asia, where the majority of papers are made from processed plants, Europeans never crack the code of how to take raw plant materials, like bast fibers, which is the fibers from the inside of a tree. So if you open up a tree, you'll find these white fibrous materials between that and the interior of the tree. And that's in East Asia what you make papers from usually. In Europe, there's no way to turn that material into paper. So instead, you rely on vast armies of rag pickers. So pre-modern European cities had people who would go through garbage, who would pick out soiled, dirty, discarded materials, and then they would sell these rags to paper mills. And so already that should give you a sense that European paper is something quite different. And what that means is that Chinese paper mills and European paper mills had to be organized very differently. In pre-modern Europe, paper was always very expensive. And that's because you had to have rag pickers, usually in urban locations, collect these materials. Then they would bring them to paper mills. They would sell them wholesale. And so mills actually had to be relatively close to cities. In China, on the other hand, basically everyone could engage in papermaking. So every farmer's family, especially during off-season times, so in the north during the winter, in the south between harvests, they would engage, many of them would engage in small levels of paper production. And so in this image here, you can see what this Chinese handmade paper, this is a bamboo paper, looked like. In it, you can see bits of fiber. This is actually straw. And so this paper was very, very inexpensive to produce in East Asia. And so Chinese paper, unlike European paper, was much, much less expensive. So for printing a book like the Gutenberg Bible, it's now estimated that the costs of paper were over 75% of the production costs for the Gutenberg Bible, because you had to buy hundreds and hundreds of sheets, and then they would sit in storage. Whereas in East Asia, because paper is common, books could be relatively cheap. The next aspect of these papers is that they're actually quite different. Because European papers are made from rags, they tend to be very stiff. European paper is not flexible in the same way as Chinese papers. And this is both good and bad. Because European papers are so stiff and thick, you can print on both sides. And they also survive better over a long period of time. Chinese papers, on the other hand, were so thin that often printers were only chose to print on one side of paper. And those examination sheets, which we have at UCLA, are kind of a thick cardstock, and that's because they're made, each one, from gluing 7 sheets of Chinese paper together. So next, we're going to talk about characters and the fonts in Chinese and European books, what these differences tell us about how information cultures evolved over time. And so in this image here, you see 3 scripts, all of which have their roots in the rise of printing, both in the 16th century. So both Times New Roman, Italic, as well as the Chinese font we call the Song style script, are all actually contemporaries. They're all products of the global boom in printing in the 16th centuries. So the first thing to know about the difference between Europe and China is that European books were written in a number of different things we call book hands. So starting around the year 800, the Carolingian Empire, based in France, creates this thing called Carolingian minuscule you can see at the top. And this is kind of the root of all European scripts. But what happens is the rounded shape of this minuscule is not very good for writing with quills. And so over time, the hand gets more and more angular, more and more formalized. And so that we get these family of scripts called Gothics. So most pre-modern European books that were written before the invention of the Gutenberg press were in these different Gothic hands. Um, and Gothic hands presented major problems because even though they were legible to the people who wrote the books, they often weren't legible across international boundaries or even across time. So by the year 1400, it was very difficult for people to be reading things like Textura Quadrata from about 1250. So it was not a very conservative system for writing, which means that even today, those of us who are fluent English readers in the room, I imagine all of us, can't necessarily pick up something like the Ellesmere Chaucer at the Huntington Library and read the hand, which is this Anglicana cursive. And so I've transcribed one line here for you. So of his person, I have here his likeness. So here you have an H that's very loose. It's P with a line under it is Persone. I have here his likeness. And so you can just look at this for a moment and realize that this is not easy to read. In fact, this past summer, I had to take a week-long course in just learning how to read what we call English secretary hand. So every type of European script across history has its own idiosyncrasies, and you have to be trained in those. And that's as true today as it was in the 13th, 14th century. And so what that meant is with the emergence of printing, Europe had a process of standardization. So when Gutenberg first printed the 42-line Bible, he printed in what's called a Gutenberg Gothic. And so you could see this is not a particularly easy script to read. Incipit epistula sancti Hieronymi ad Paulinium presbyterium de omnibus divinae historia libris capitulum primum. So that's not necessarily an easy font for us to read. And so what happens is with the invention of printing, this wide variety of different scripts and fonts are slowly standardized, especially in Italy. And one of the reasons UCLA Special Collections decided to collect heavily in pre-modern Italy is because this humanist font, which is adopted in the 1470s in Italy, based off a revival of the early Carolingian book scripts, creates a new real renaissance, we can say. They're looking back to antiquity for models. And so this is the root of what we call Times New Roman, the sort of font we're all familiar with. And these fonts in Italy that are invented then spread out and become the fonts that are generally used across the rest of Europe. So the invention of printing takes this plurality of different book hands and scripts and at least makes printed books start looking legible across space. And one of the people most responsible for this revolution is this figure, Aldus Manutius, who I mentioned at the beginning. UCLA Library Special Collections has the largest collection of Aldus Manutian printed books in North America. We have almost everything printed by him, his sons, his grandsons. Anyone the name Manutius appears with, we have their books. And the reason for that is because Aldus was the first person to print books in this sort of size. It's called a portale size. And the reason he was able to print these small format books is because he invented this italic font, based again off this early Carolingian font. And this font had benefits. It was condensed, so you could fit more type on a page. It was also very legible, despite being condensed. And so you could make your books smaller and smaller and smaller and save money, because saving money was saving paper. And Aldus's fonts and this new italic type, which saved paper, then became most popular in Europe among printers. Now, interestingly enough, if we turn to China at about the same time, we see the modern Chinese sort of book font emerge. But unlike in Europe, Chinese scripts, these varieties of what we call kaishu, sort of modern Chinese scripts that are invented, really popularized by the calligrapher Wang Xizhi around the year 300. These varieties of kaishu are all legible generally across time. And so in this first image here, one of the UCLA text, one of our oldest books in special collections. This is an 8th century Chinese scroll. It's a Buddhist scroll from Dunhuang. And if you know modern Chinese, you may not be able to understand the grammar of this. But most of the characters in here are perfectly legible to you. So you have here lai, E is still the same E. It's always been R is still the same R. It's always been, fa. So most of us who can read Chinese can look at this scroll and see that there's no major script difference in fundamental ways. So unlike that Chaucer at the Huntington Library, when I pull this out to show undergraduates at UCLA, those who can read Chinese are very excited to see they can read 8th century Chinese scrolls. That doesn't mean Chinese scripts are all the same, obviously. After printing becomes popular, so printing in China starts around the 7th century, but it really takes off after about the year 1000 because of the examination system I talked about earlier. And the models for printing tend to be individual calligraphic styles. And so here we have 3 books. Their dates you can see on the side. So this is a printed book from between 1193-94, printed book from 1163 to 89, and a printed book from 1038, between 1038 and 1059. These all have different calligraphic styles. And the sort of root of Chinese bibliography for identifying very old books is being able to recognize the differences of the 3 main varieties of calligraphic styles. So there is an O style, which is based on the calligraphy of a figure named Ouyang Shun. There's the Yan style from Yan Zhenqing, and a Liu style, Liu Gongquan style calligraphy. And I'll talk about these briefly. So unlike those very different European scripts, the differences between these Chinese calligraphic styles and printing are very subtle. So here we have this example of an O style calligraphy. And here, Chen Xianxing, he says that it comes from the clear hooks on characters that are square but round internally. And so you can recognize an O style calligraphy because it has a certain squareness to it, as well as these very clear hooks on the side. So it's a very thin style of calligraphy, but it's very clear. The other main style of early calligraphy is this Yan style calligraphy. This is very common in books printed in Sichuan in the 10th, 11th, 12th century. And so here we see the difference is that you have thick vertical strokes, and it's, as they say, broad and clear where the brush is lifted from the character. So you've got these very thick sort of down strokes. You see it's a little thinner in these horizontal strokes. And then also where the brush lifts off. So if we look at this Y, you see it's a much thicker brush lift. So just to look back, you can see this is thin all the way around, and where the brushes lift off, it's not so robust as the Yan style. And finally, the last one I'll briefly introduce is this Zhao style calligraphy, because this is very popular up until the end of the Qing Dynasty in 1911 for government publications. And I think you can see that this is one of the easiest styles to identify. It's a very thick, robust style of calligraphy. And so we see this in government publications starting really from about the year 1360 on up until the end of the Qing Dynasty. So those 3 styles of calligraphy are common in books really up until about the year 1500. As you can see, they're all quite aesthetically beautiful. They're quite balanced. But what happens in Europe and China at the same time, um, a sort of economic revolution leads to increased print productivity. And so while Aldus Manutius invents italic type, which popularizes, um, beginning in 1500, but really taking off in the 1550s, is a type of script called Song style script. So the previous scripts, which were all actually used in the Song dynasty, are said to be the inspiration for this script. And so you see it has a sort of Song dynasty. It still looks rather nice. But in fact, these characters are a lot more simple. There's less flourish. So this does not, in this bay, this bottom stroke doesn't look like a brush stroke anymore. These are very quick and easy to carve. So increasingly characters become squarer. So this is a more clear grid pattern in the page layout. And that's because money matters. And so with this script, instead of having 10 characters per line, you suddenly can have 16 up to even 20 characters per line in the average size book. And then they're also carved more quickly. So beginning in the 1500, the book market booms and more people are engaged in making scripts or in making books cheaply available. And so sort of to briefly summarize the differences in these fonts is that in pre-modern Europe, readers starting about the year 1500 could no longer really read earlier manuscripts, especially things from the year 1200, 1300. In China, we see this longer connection where people are interested in texts and manuscripts from much earlier periods. They can read them. But under similar market demands, both Europeans and Chinese arrive at sort of simplified scripts that save space and make money. So the last thing we'll do is briefly consider a few different print technologies to talk about the divergences between Chinese and European printing. And for me, this is one of these major issues because most people don't respect Chinese print technologies. They think they're somehow more primitive than European print technologies. But in fact, when you consider them within the context of East Asia, Chinese print looks remarkably rational. So to give you a sense of how good Chinese printing technology is, we're just going to take a brief look at this video, which will show you how fast someone can print a page of Chinese from a wood block. So basically everything that I think is wonderful about Chinese print technologies is visible here. First, Chinese printing is cheap and easy. The paper is cheaper. After the wood blocks have already been carved, printing from them is very cheap. And also it takes very little training to learn how to print reasonably good prints from Chinese wood blocks. And so this means that there's sort of a basic lower investment from publishers. Also, the wood block that's being used in this video, I took this video in 2017 in Sichuan, is over 100 years old, which means that unlike with movable type, there's no expiration date to Chinese print technology. So once a family or families had invested in making sure, invested in getting a set of blocks carved, that was the most technical part of the whole process, was finding carvers. Then they could store and use the blocks to print books anytime they wanted, basically on demand. So in some ways, it's an on-demand print technology that could stick with your family for generations. This slide is in Chinese. The second feature of wood blocks is that even after you lost wood blocks, you could then repair them or continue using some of those wood blocks in amended editions. And so in China, we have this very unique case of these things called Dixioban. This is a many repaired edition. And so in the Ming Dynasty, founded in 1368, ends in 1644, we have books of the histories that have wood blocks in them from editions that are from the Song Dynasty. So we have blocks from about the year 1000. And then we have other blocks from about the year 1300. And then it goes all the way up to that in the same book. You can have blocks from the Qing Dynasty, the Ming Dynasty, the Yuan Dynasty, and the Song Dynasty, all in a single edition. And so this is just an example for you to consider, like, that's really incredible and interesting that these blocks can be used for that long. Now, Gutenberg's printing press, on the other hand, is something that is rightfully lauded as a major innovation. But it was, in fact, a combination of a series of different technologies. So on the left here, we see the European wine press. It's already existed before Gutenberg. And you can see the similar structure between the wine press and the printing press. They have this screw-turned press. They're mounted on similar sorts of legs. And so almost everything in the European Gutenberg printing press is something that existed already. And let me see, I may have to switch screens for you to see this video. So compared to the Chinese printing process, you can see that there are a lot more steps involved to printing a sheet of paper on the Gutenberg press. So that's one major difference. Chinese printing is simple, cheap, efficient. European movable type printing, at least the printing part of the process, takes a lot of time. But it does have the advantage of being highly mobile as a technology. So whereas in China you have block carvers who travel from city to city offering their services, in Europe, once the suite, the set of technologies is invented for printing, you see a rapid expansion across Europe of print technologies. So in 1450, we just have Gutenberg printing in Mainz. By 1460, it's getting to Italy, and so on and so forth. So by 1500, we have printing spread across Europe, and it's movable type. So that means they can be printing any book that they could possibly imagine. The real major difference is the process of casting type. This is Gutenberg's major contribution, which is how to make type quickly and cheaply. While there's movable type printing in East Asia, this punch and matrix system is never invented. And we'll just take a really quick look at this other video. So you'll see here how fast you can cast type. So this is the mold he's holding in his hand. And the matrix is laying beneath the mold. So where he's about to pour the lead in, there is a engraved sort of piece of steel that has the face of the piece of font he's casting. And so he's now making sure the lead is settling fully into this. And this is a 72, size 72 piece of font, so it takes a little longer. And now that the lead is cool, you can open it, and that's the matrix that has the face on it. And there's the piece of type, which he could take out of the mold. So that ability to cast type is really one of the fundamental differences in East Asia. And just so you can see again this image, here we have the matrix which slides under the mold, and this top part is where the molten lead was poured in. So it's this little box contraption. Now, just to give you some sort of food for thought, one of the main things I'm trying to get my students to understand and people I talk to more generally is in the context of early print technologies, we have to sort of move away from this notion that there is one better or one worse, that there is a more advanced or a less advanced form of printing. Wood blocks had lots and lots of strength. This wood block here is from my own collection at home. It's from about the year 1700. I've pulled prints off this. That's a pretty remarkable thing. On the other hand, the ability to use movable type and make any sorts of books you want is also a pretty remarkable thing. And so evaluating these technologies on their own terms, we can see that they both have strengths that we have to assess separately. And so when we say the Chinese invented printing, this is true. And then when we say Gutenberg invented printing, this is also true. So they can both have invented printing because I think, as you can see now, they were working in totally different worlds. From the worlds of paper, their papers were different, to the worlds of the scripts they had to be considering when they wanted to start printing, all the way down to then the basic ways of pulling a print. And so rather than trying to compare these things as though they're in a competition, I think we have to take seriously what it means to approach technologies and histories of the book on their own terms. And so with that, I think I will conclude my talk, and I'm happy to take questions from anyone. And these can be questions about, say, the UCLA Library, or we can talk more in depth about books and printing history.
Well, so far we don't have any questions. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A. Let's see. Bobby, do you have any questions? Or here, you should unmute yourself.
Earlier, we were talking about book binding. Maybe you could go into that a little bit, because the people in the audience, the other people didn't have the benefit of hearing it.
Yeah, so one of the other major differences between Chinese and European books is, of course, book binding structures. So pre-modern European books looked, like a modern book. One difference is, first, after a European book was printed, they weren't bound in the shop. They would have been sent to professional binders after usually someone had already selected and purchased the book. And so up until really the 19th century, most European book bindings were selected by the people who purchased the books. So they were all bespoke. In China, we have two sort of major book binding traditions. So we have books like this. This is a hard, what we call sutra binding format. And so this is a format where it's accordion and it folds out very nicely. And so this is the earliest form of what we call a codex style book in China. Later, really in the 11th, 12th century, we start seeing these books pasted in the back, and they're sort of bound together with paste here. And that paste binding, while beautiful and great, had the downside of attracting rodents. And so rodents were a major problem in East Asia for book preservation. So starting around the year 1500 is when we see this most common style of thread binding, the string binding that you see in lots of pre-modern Chinese books. And so this was the printed sheets, which again are printed only on one side, are sort of folded over like this. So you'd have printing on both sides, folded over like this. Then you have paper tacks. So wadded up paper sort of nails holds the structure together, and then you would do the thread binding on it. And so it's a very different style of binding than we see in Europe.
Okay, we have some questions trickling in. Well, the first one is from Kathy Wales. It's more of a comment, no question, because it was such an excellent talk. But there's a question from Dale G. Since the ink goes through Chinese paper, were the blocks carved in reverse?
So the blocks were carved in reverse because when you print, you want to sort of pull the image off. And so in Chinese books, it is the side of the paper facing down onto the block that is then used for binding. So you can see through the paper, but it's not totally transparent. Some books have very, very thin paper that's almost transparent. But the blocks are carved in reverse just because that's the way relief printing usually works everywhere.
Okay, there's a question from Janet Keys. How does Korean movable type printing fit into this history?
So that's a great question. So the first, as I'm sure some people in the audience know, the first movable type printed book in the world that still survives is a Korean text called the Jiki. And this is printed in a Korean Buddhist temple around the year 1380. And so, as with all things, there's a big debate about who invented movable type printing first, Korea or China. There are Chinese accounts from the 11th century about the existence of movable type printing. And there's also movable type printing in neighboring languages like medieval Uyghur, which is a Turkic dialect. So the reason Korean movable type printing is so well known, however, is important, which is that unlike in China, in Korea, most printing is done by the state. So the state has lots of money. And so because the state has lots of money, it invests heavily in casting huge fonts of Chinese characters. So, if you want 10,000 Chinese characters to print a book, you need 10,000 pieces of type plus, redundancies. So that was actually very expensive. In a place like Korea, though, because the Korean court, the Joseon court, prohibited most of the private book trade, the Korean state was able to emerge as the major printing house, really, for Korean people. And so that means really from about 1440 on, a large percentage of Korean books are printed in movable type. And that's not the same in China. Now, I'll add an interesting case to this, because lots of people say, well, like the huge character set is why movable type didn't take off in China. But you have to keep in mind, we always have Japan. And so in katakana or hiragana, you actually don't need a lot of characters to print a book. And so there is a brief moment, really, from about the 1580s up until the 1630s, where you see a reasonable amount of movable type printing in Japan. But then we again see that is abandoned. So even though Japanese works very well for movable type printing, as does, say, Hangul in Korea, the woodblock is preferred because you can play with different things like page layout much more easily in woodblock. And like I said, it's actually cheaper to print stuff in woodblock because you can just keep printing the same books over and over again for several hundred years.
Okay, so June Lee asked, how different is a movable type idea in East Asia from the West?
That's a great question, June. And I think that in some ways, the ideas are similar, right? We've got these individual pieces of type that you can set and then you can pull prints from. But as I mentioned in the talk, that mode of production, the idea of having a matrix where you can cast piece of type after piece of type after piece of type is like a fundamentally radically different way of producing type. In China, the most common way of producing type is still woodblock carving. So you'll have individuals carving woodblock pieces of type, and then they'll use those. In Korea, it's a bronze cast in sand. So you have to, after you've cast it once, you can't use that form anymore. And so that matrix means that it's a really much more efficient process in Europe to make movable type. But sorry, I can add one more thing. But people in East Asia know about that because of Jesuit printing in Macau and Nagasaki starting in the 1580s, and it still doesn't take off.
Okay, Kathy Wales now has a question. Can you draw any comparisons between the types of books that are being printed in Europe and China?
Boy, I love this question. So if you were to think about the major defining institutions, so the things that sort of loomed at the center of people's lives in pre-modern China and Europe, you have radically different answers. So in East Asia, especially in China, it's the state itself. So the dynasty, the Ming dynasty, the Qing dynasty. And the way that state has structured society is that the best way to become successful is to pass the standardized examination. And after you pass the examination, even if you pass the lowest levels, your family never pays taxes again, which is pretty great. I wish I didn't have to pay taxes because of all my degrees, but I do. And so in East Asia, that means the most common books are texts from the classical tradition, which are what the examination is based off of, and also examination primers. So it'd be like imagining if you were to go into Barnes and Noble and 80% of the shelf space is occupied by SAT, GRE, LSAT, NCAT prep books. That's the bulk of the market. That's where all the money is. And so people buy that stuff. In Europe, and again, it's much more complicated because we have lots of different states. But again, the church really is the center of intellectual and cultural life. And so sermons are very popular. You get lots of short tracts and sermons, devotional texts. Both Catholics and Protestants are printing lots and lots of books to defend their particular version of faith. But of course, starting in 1800, right, really 1800, things like news, newsletters, these things take off. And then, of course, literature and fiction once we move even further through time.
Also, another comparison question from Wei Ling. Can you compare the types of ink used in Europe and China?
Yeah. Again, a great question. So the types of ink used for printing or calligraphy in China are the same. It's what we could technically call a lamp black, a mo, right? So this is a pine soot-based ink. So you burn some wood in a little sort of jar thing, and the soot from that burning settles on the top, and then you can scrape it off, and you have that dust, which is then mixed with a processed animal glue so that you get an ink stick. I don't have an ink stick at my desk here. And so it's just a pure carbon ink, and this is great. It holds true for a very long time and is water fast. So in Europe, with the introduction of parchment, so again, animal skins, people start writing with what's called an iron gall ink. So manuscripts are written in an iron gall ink. This is an ink that's acidic enough that it could burn into European parchment, so animal skin, and not be washed off. And up until 1800, this is what everyone does their handwriting with. It's not great for paper. It often burns holes through paper. The worst is if you go to a place like the Vatican Library, where Jesuits will have taken lots of notes in Chinese books in iron gall ink. It destroys the paper. It just eats right through it. Now, the printing press uses more like a lamp black ink that has oil added to it so that it can stick to the type, because it's metal type, so it has to have a certain viscosity. And that's what that ink is made from.
Karen E asked, did the paper and the differences in materials it was made from affect the printing technologies, like heavier rag paper perhaps not being ideal for woodblock print?
That's a good question, Karen. So the Chinese method of printing with that light paper is called rubbing. So for European paper, they still use carved wood blocks, but the difference is they would actually put the carved wood blocks in with the type. So it's still exerting tons and tons of force onto the relief carved wood block in order to pull a print off. But really, the reason for woodblock printing, I wouldn't say that, sorry, let me think about this. So lots of European books had woodblocks included in them. And so maybe it's not an issue of their woodblock printing not being popular in Europe. It's just that it's a graphic component. It's for illustration. It's for certain textual flourishes. So there's still lots of woodblock carving in both places. It's just not the primary mode of printing.
Okay, Susan Dixon asks, why did China start using simplified fonts? People who use simplified fonts can't read traditional. How does this matter?
Oh, Susan, that's a 20th century question. So the reason for the emergence of simplified Chinese, and it dates to really the mid 1950s, early 60s, is because of mass literacy campaigns in the People's Republic of China, as well as concerns about needing to have a sort of modernized script that's accessible to all the people. Now, I think we all know for a fact that anyone can learn to read either script. And so it really has much more to do with ideology and ideological programs than it has to do with any sort of practical application. I mean, it is impressive, however, that the People's Republic of China took a relatively low literacy rate and reached nearly universal literacy by the 1960s. But I wouldn't say that it's because of the font being simpler in a way that's really meaningful.
Okay, Patricia Thompson asked, when did printing of newspaper and books become accessible to people who are not the church or rulers of European or Chinese cultures?
That's a great question. So the rise of, say, newspapers, the first newspapers date, and I'll talk about printed newspapers because if I talk about manuscripts or news sheets, that's a whole different thing. Around 1606, newspapers as a form emerge in Germany. And so they slowly start becoming more popular. So the Dutch adopt them first. Then the English have sort of occasional use of newspapers. But they become a more or less regular feature for middle class, business folk in European cities. I would guess by about 1680 would be a not totally incorrect. And of course, that's the big cities, places like London, Amsterdam, a city like Hamburg would have newspapers, but places in the provinces wouldn't. In China, there's an official newsletter already since basically the Song Dynasty. It goes into print really for the first time, as far as we know, in the 1630s. But real universal newspapers as we think of them, and this is our Western conception of newspapers, don't pick up until English printers in Shanghai start major lithographic presses and movable type printing.
Okay, USAC asks, which technology had more impact on the future printing? Why? Is there any meaning for them in today's world?
I think that's a pretty tricky question. So on the one hand, we have Chinese printing, which, as I said, is form stable. So you have the block, you keep the block, and that means it's print on demand. And so you can think of wood blocks and that stable form as more precociously modern in some ways. Being able to hit print on your computer for a book you've downloaded is almost the same as pulling printing off a pre-existing wood block. And so I think that what that means is we're actually in a sort of hybrid place where in some ways, for example, in China, there was always a very lively and great pirated book culture. People were freely circulating copyrighted materials online, downloading it, printing it, sharing PDFs, much, I would say, much more aggressively than, say, Western academics, who are very wedded to the material text. I think a lot of that has to do with differences in ideas of text and mobility that are actually rooted in these pre-modern printing cultures.
Okay, I guess that's most of the questions. Oh, wait, we have well, there's two more. Chuck Wu asked a question, but I'm not sure. Maybe you can relate this to printing. Is the same type of paper used for both calligraphy and painting by literati?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chuck. And the same literati had different tastes than printers, but for calligraphy and painting paper, because it's all water-based ink, people would tend to use the same types of higher quality papers. Something in Chinese we call a xuanzhi. So this is a locally produced paper from Anhui was considered the best. It still holds that title, but every place in China makes their own specific high quality handmade papers. And so that's one of again, a big difference between Europe and China. It's because in China, every place can make its own paper. It's actually quite difficult to then, as a historian and scholar, go identify different types of paper because there was so many different varieties. It's hard to say, this paper is from one place or the other. And so calligraphers or painters would, they'd know a guy who had a paper they liked, and usually it'd be more based off a lifetime of trying different papers and a different paper for every occasion.
Okay, you have questions and compliments from Philip Bloom, who says, also, I should have said, great talk, Devin, thank you. But Philip's question was, what woods were used for Chinese wood blocks? Is it regionally dependent? Also, any evidence for non-pine-based inks in Chinese printing?
Philip, this is the question where we start getting into the weeds. And I'll first answer bluntly, which is that I have never read anything that has, in a systematic or scientific way, gone through and tested either existing wood blocks to identify wood types or inks. And so because of the great heterogeneity of Chinese paper print cultures, I would say that, the anecdote everyone says is, like a pear wood was really good for wood blocks. But the wood blocks I have downstairs in my study are wood blocks of, 6 different types of wood, from the cheapest plywood, literally a plywood that was carved in the 60s, to like the hardest, finest oak or maple or something like that. And so I think that this is one thing that we need to do as China studies scholars, is start working more closely with conservators and starting to get a finer handle on these issues.
Okay, this might be a good
Oh,
place.
I have one question.
Oh, Bobby. Okay, go ahead. And then we have
I'm just wondering, well, the wood blocks had to be, it must have taken a tremendous amount of space and storage to store a number of books. And then would each publisher store these books, and what would happen when they changed businesses or changed hands? How would you trace how to get back to these books?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bob, and you're putting your finger on something that's kind of fun, which is it's a great deal of fun to watch publishers sell the blocks to other publishers. So if you find an edition of a text, you'll often find that the publishing house name has been scratched out and a new sort of woodblock plug is inserted. And so if you compare block edition against edition, you'll see, oh, these are the same blocks, except that, at some point, one firm sold the blocks to another. And so, in fact, storage was also really expensive. The Forbidden City in Beijing has 220,000 woodblocks, and they're literally, I don't know, probably a mile of shelf space or something like that. It's just like a mind-blowing thing to walk into that warehouse. And so they were, that's the hidden cost, is storage, preservation over time. So it's all well and good to have carved big books with thousands of blocks, but it takes space. And so that is a real constraint.
Okay, one last question from Linda Lum. Where's the special collection housed in UCLA? Which UCLA library?
Thanks for that question, Linda. So the UCLA Library Special Collections is in the YRL, the Young Library in North Campus. And so if you walk into the library and then go downstairs, you'll find special collections right there through a pair of glass doors. And so I should note that anyone who's interested in going to special collections is able to register online, and then you can request materials. So if you want to go to UCLA and look at a 10th century Chinese printed book, you are free to do so, because anyone who's a registered reader can look at these materials. And so I'll just pop my email into chat, that if you have any questions about the collection or holdings, I'm very happy to talk to you. Now, obviously, we're closed right now, and we will not be on campus until at least mid-June. And so everything is secure and sleeping. So if you want to come after the pandemic is a little bit more under control, we'd really welcome you. And, I hope now that this is the second time I've had an opportunity to talk to to you all as a community, hopefully we can someday do something at UCLA and I can show you some of the real treasures from our collection.
All right, thank you.
Well,
Bobby, last remarks?
Well, I think that's a wonderful invitation that we will have to remember to take advantage of. And I want to thank Devin for a really great program. I think all of us who were in the audience enjoyed it and learned something from it. So thanks once again. And I guess maybe we should find out from you what we can learn from the I Ching book, because maybe we're going to try that next month. And they say it's a good way of finding magical things about China.
Oh, that's too deep for me, Bob. So.
That's why I hope it'll be easy and something that all of us maybe can enjoy. The person who's doing the talk, he's a Korean who has a PhD and who teaches Chinese language. And I think he had a course last fall on the book of the I Ching. And I guess it was a book for his students who were learning Chinese. So I hope it wasn't too difficult and that it's something that all of us probably can understand and that we will enjoy. Okay, well, I guess we can close the meeting. I want to thank again, Devin. I want to thank the Chinese Historical Society and Felicia for helping out so much. I think our program probably will be listed on YouTube. I'm going to have to figure out a good title for it, so people will and maybe Devin can give us a good title where it will be something that will be easily accessed. Okay, well, thank you again and good night. Hope to see you next month.
Thank you. Bye-bye.